Hello class and welcome to week 4 of History and Systems of Psychology. Wow, I cannot believe it's actually week 4. We're halfway through this course. This course is definitely flying by. So this lecture video will serve the purpose as to reviewing your materials that are due for week 4. I will have a brief overview of chapter 7 throughout the textbook, as well as review the other materials that you need to complete for this week. So let's jump right in. So for this week's reading, you'll need to read chapter 7 in your Sharab book. You will also have a couple other supplemental reading on Pavlov, Thorndike, and Bekacherev. You know, I am not very good at pronouncing names if you've watched all the videos thus far. But I'll just call him Vladimir. So you'll have those supplemental readings, as well as a little video of John B. Watson and his experiments on Little Albert, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. It's a very interesting experiment that has been one of the main experiments talked about through the history of psychology, and it's a key influencer in today's work. So it's very interesting. So I'll talk about that more. You'll also have some supplemental reading on Pavlov and Watson, just to deepen your understanding of behaviorism and concepts and ideas and theories that Pavlov and Watson developed. You'll have your discussion number 4, and this will be on the Pavlov religious orientation article. So it'll be basically your thoughts and just things surrounding this article. Oh, sorry. And then you will have your exam for chapter 2. So I just want to reach back and touch and bases with you guys and see how you felt about exam 1. If it was too short of time, how you felt, what were your thoughts, if you made a good grade, things like that. So just reach out to me, let me know, so I can make those adjustments for next time. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So the first thing I guess I'll talk about is the Little Albert experiment. And I'm sure some of you may have heard about this experiment. You may not have. The Little Albert experiment was a famous psychology experiment that was conducted by, of course, John B. Watson. But he also had a graduate student that he was working with. Her name was Rosalie Rayner. You may or may not know, may not be described in this video, but I just wanted to implement that as well. But this was previously studied by a Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. So, as you notice, that Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson are kind of synonymous in this article, and as well as this week's reading. So Pavlov, he conducted experiments demonstrating conditioning and the process in dogs. So what Watson did in this case, he was interested in taking Pavlov's research to further show that emotional reactions could be classically conditioned in people. So if you think back to what Pavlov did specifically about classical conditioning with dogs, so he basically trained a dog to respond to unconditional and conditional stimuli, involving food and a bell and salivation of the bell. So the dog would hear the bell and he would salivate because he knew that food was coming. So as the experiment progressed, Pavlov removed the food aspect from the conditioning process, and immediately when the bell rung, the dog would salivate, even though the food was not coming. So that was just showing that animals could be classically conditioned, and Watson wanted to see if that was possible within humans. So just taking a deeper look in terms of Little Albert, and Little Albert is still talked about today because we often, people in the psychology world wonder, is he okay today? Is he still having any experiences from this experiment? Because it definitely can be considered traumatic. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So the participant, Little Albert, he was about 9 months old. So what Watson did was expose him to a series of stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, a mask, and a burning newspaper, and observed the boy's reactions. So little Albert initially showed no fear with any of the objects shown. So the next time Albert was presented or exposed to a rat, and then Watson continued that with making a loud noise by hitting a pipe with a hammer. So naturally, of course, little Albert begins to cry after hearing the loud noise. Once that happens, Watson created, repeatedly pairing the white rat with the sound of a loud noise. And of course, little Albert began to cry simply after seeing just the rat, without even the loud noise being present. So it created this traumatic experience for the child. So every time a white rat was present, the child would cry because he assumed that the next response would be the loud noise. So, of course, Watson, from this, and his assistant Rayner, concluded that the instant that the rat was shown, the baby began to cry. And almost instantly, he turned sharply and demonstrated symptoms of fear. So just thinking about how little, forms of stimuli and condition and classical conditioning can have an effect on someone, or specifically this child, in their adolescent life. But as we know, and we learn through lifespan or things like that, is that these things that happen to us as a child greatly affect us as adults as well. So regardless of this unconditioned or conditioned response and stimuli, it created fear, and it created a conditioned stimuli to this experiment. So after that experience with the rat, little Albert didn't just fear white rats, he also feared other white objects as well. So bunny rabbits, things like that. So just thinking about, the major toll that was created on little Albert, and why so many people in the psychology industry still wonder if little Albert is okay today, because of what was conducted on him. And many people consider what they did to him is very unethical, and would not be conducted today in this day and age. So yeah, that's the story behind little Albert. It's very interesting. And if you guys watch the video, please let me know what your thoughts are. If you want to add that in your discussion board post, if it's relatable, please do. And I look forward to hearing your feedback on that. So I did a little change on that. So sorry. As I mentioned before, the psychology really interests me. So let's move on to chapter 7. So chapter 7 will be in regards to birth and development of behaviors tradition. So as always, I don't want to spend too much time on this material, but I do want to skim through a few of the components discussed. So the main being, of course, there's several developments contributed to early behaviorism. There's animal psychology, there's general psychology, and of course, a search for new methods. So animal psychology, basically what this was is the major factors in determining stimulation and behaviorism. Researchers studied animals and believed, there was a principle of, like it says, continuity. So whatever happened within animals will happen within humans. And you see that oftentimes today where they do animal testing prior to having the testing or the product be delivered on animals. But as you know, with the recent development of PETA and things like that, there's a lot of activism going on. So where we get our basis of results will vary greatly and hinder greatly because of this movement. So just thinking in terms of that, how many vaccines and things like that have to be tested on humans. So just thinking on those terms. So both human and animals represent one natural world and must be subject to similar laws. So basically, the history of psychology, we've always studied behaviorism and things like that on animals. prior to developing that into that of humans. And also, too, the success of general physiology. So in the 19th century, many psychologists were encouraged to turn to physiology of the brain and nervous system to determine what developed into behaviorism and what attributed to the actions and things that we did. So we've read about this, how they would look to the brain and nervous system to develop ideas based on, the chemicals that throughout the brain, how our nervous system worked, and how that can develop the way we behave, specifically with the discussion of dopamine, norepinephrine, things like that. Those chemicals in our brain that allow us to think, feel, act, and things like that are what are contributed to the way we behave, what we think as human beings. And lastly, a search for new methods. So, of course, many psychologists treated introspective self-reports as unreliable methods. They believe that psychology as an experimental science should turn to a new generation of experimental methods. So that's what enhanced our ability to study and do research, analyze, and things like that. So development of new methods and trying to find which method works the best is greatly what impacted and contributed to early behaviorism, which is interesting because it's still going on today, as scientists and psychologists try to develop so many things that can determine why we behave the way we do and what can prevent that and what can help us in the realm of psychology. So the animal and comparative psychologists. These were the three psychologists that are discussed in terms of the animal comparative ways. So as we mentioned before, how animals were tested prior to humans because they believed that they were synonymous. So Lewis Henry Morgan, George Romanes, and Jacques Loeb. So Morgan was a psychologist, he would be considered today more of anthropologist, I believe, but he was still in the realm of psychology. He argued that animals, like humans, possess many mental abilities such as reason, creativity, and moral judgment. So he portrayed, human behavior or human terms, resulting in similar animal behavior as anthropomorphism. Yes. And then also Romanes, he published his book on animal intelligence. And it's similar to what Morgan was discussing in terms of, animal and comparative psychology. And lastly, Loeb, he was a German zoologist, and he studied tropisms, which is a physical and chemical reaction of orientation of the organisms in a field of force. And of course, that contributed favorably to the stimulation of specific type behaviors in animals in comparison to humans. Lastly, Edward Thorndike. He was a huge component into psychology today. And you'll read a little bit more about him, but I don't want to spend too much time. Ivan Pavlov, like as I mentioned before, he was instrumental in specifically conditioned and unconditioned stimuli and responses. So he demonstrated on the salivary responses. So we talked about how the dog in response to the bell. So let's just talk a little bit about the, reflexes and stimuli and responses. So unconditioned reflex, what do you think that means? So specifically, it's a reflex or response that are associated with the direct influence of substance on the receptors within the mouth. They are inborn. Dogs do not learn how to salivate when the food enters their mouth. And then you have conditioned responses, which is the opposite of that. So it's also called an acquired reflex. So this is something that is learned, and they can occur under two conditions. The first being a specific environment which the reflex is formed, and that's where you see the dog and the bell response. And the second instance is of the unconditioned reflex. So that's something that already happens whenever, even humans, whenever people do the happy dance or they salivate before they're eating, that is a unconditioned response to food. So let's see, associative connections. There's a couple other things that I want to talk to you about. Animal research, no. Reflexology. Behaviorism and of John Watson. So this is another key area of discussion. So he operated off of three founding principles of behaviorism: stimuli and response. So that means the behavior is set of responses to specific signals. Number two, habit formation. So the specific behavior response becomes useful and retained. And then habitat integration. So that's simple reactions develop into complex acts. So these are the three things that Watson, his principles surrounding behaviorism were developed. Let me see. I think that's all. There's one other thing I want to talk to you about, specifically in talking in terms of behaviorism. And I know we've talked a lot about how, uncontrolled stimuli and conditioned stimuli and things like that are responses. But whenever I was in graduate school, I had a guest speaker come in and talk to us about behaviorism and how what we learn in our younger years and things like that are continued throughout life. And we talked about maybe attachment styles and things like that, and lifespan development and how important those things are. But just in thinking in terms of our experiences and our behaviors. So this guest speaker came in and he talked about how he was deathly afraid of flying, and that every time he would get on the plane, it would feel like his heart was going to stop. He would have chest pains. It felt like he was choking. And so ever since then, he avoided flying like the plague. He would not get on a plane. He was so scared. And that's just how his life was. He just never wanted to get on a plane. Well, he ended up going home for, I think he had to do a lecture or a guest lecture somewhere. And he went home and visited his parents. And by then he had become a new father. So he was talking to his wife, trying to figure out what method they would do to help their child be able to fly, because he didn't want to be stuck and not be able to fly and go on things, and he wanted to be able to raise his child and teach his child to overcome these fears. And so he went home, and him and his family were talking. He was just like, I can't get over this fear. Like, I'm so scared of flying. It feels like I'm choking and I'm going to pass out. And his mom and dad look at each other and they look at him, and they talk about a time where when he was around 2 years old, they were on a flight and he started choking on a peanut. And ever since then, he never wanted to go on a flight. So that experience that he experienced at a young age, at 2 years old, his body ultimately resulted in thinking that every time he got on a flight that this was going to happen again. So hence the feeling of him choking. And it's just amazing to me to think how our lives are impacted by our experiences. And I just challenge you and encourage you guys to look back and think of maybe some fears that you may have, or maybe some things that you may have developed behavior-wise as a response to your experience as a child. And it's important to think about these things and how it impacts psychology. So I just wanted to share with you guys that little story, and how, eventually he learned to overcome his fear. He went to a behaviorism specialist and he overcame his fear of flying, and he was able to teach his now daughter to not be scared of flying. So ultimately, I think that, like I mentioned before, it's all about our experiences, our perspectives, and how they shape who we are and how we are in general. So I just want to share that little gem with you guys. And I think that's all I'm going to talk to you about for this week. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. I am here for you guys for any support that you may need. And as I mentioned before in the announcements, I will be reaching out to some of you, if not all of you. It's midway through the course, and I just want to touch on that with you guys and just check in and see how everyone's doing. So look forward to that from me. As I mentioned before, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.